Hello viewers, and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the Granite State, New Hampshire. New Hampshire is one of the original 13 colonies and has the shortest shoreline of any state with just 18 miles of Atlantic Ocean beachfronts. It also contains one of the windiest places in the world. That's the top of Mount Washington. Back in 1934, the top of Mount Washington recorded wind speeds of up to 231 miles per hour, far surpassing the requirement for a Category 5 hurricane. It's also not legally required to wear a seatbelt in New Hampshire when you're driving, although I would personally recommend it very highly. New Hampshire has two congressional House districts, and they are both currently represented by Democrats. The two districts have respective partisan leans of +2 into the Republican column and +2 into the Democratic column when compared to the national average, according to the Cook Political Report's Partisan Voting Index, making them both very relatively centrist districts when compared to other states around the country. And both incumbents in both districts, both Democrats, are running for re-election this year. To see how citizens of New Hampshire have been voting for their representatives over the last decade, let's pull up a line graph right now. So looking here, we're seeing at this state level a very competitive New Hampshire going back to 2010. I mean, no matter if it's a presidential election year or a midterm year, they're always citizens from both parties are turning out in very comparable numbers. 2016 was actually the most recent flip in the House when a Democratic challenger in New Hampshire's 1st district beat the incumbent Republican that year, and then both Democrats held on to their seats in 2018. And as you can see, there's a noticeable separation going from 2016 to 2018 that favors Democrats just slightly. This is reflective of the blue wave, well, less reflective of it than other states that we've seen, where many Democrats turned out to vote 2 years ago, mainly probably as a backlash to the Republican Party and Donald Trump. We see that to a lesser degree here in New Hampshire, but it was enough for them to hold on to both districts, despite one of them having a lean slightly to the right compared to the national average. So let's toss that graph aside, and I don't think either district is going to flip this year either. The current representative of New Hampshire's 1st, Chris Pappas, is actually completing his first term. He won his first term in the midterms after the previous Democratic incumbent decided not to run for re-election in 2018. And that is the more Republican-leaning district of the two, and he was able to win 2 years ago by about an 8% margin of victory. So I think it's pretty safe to say that they're both going to be pretty easily held on to by Democrats this time around. So let's make that result official and put it on our first map right now. Mark it. Up next, we have a Senate election in New Hampshire. Incumbent Democratic Senator Shaheen is running for a 3rd term this year against Republican challenger Corky Messner and Libertarian challenger Justin O'Donnell. This is one of a few races at the Senate level where we're seeing a somewhat competitive 3-way race, I believe. But to see how citizens of New Hampshire have been voting for senators over the last few cycles, let's pull up some voter turnout ratios right now. And looking at these numbers, we're seeing some results that pretty obviously favor Republicans overall. The exception being 2014, of course, when the turnout ratios were nearly equal to each other. 2014 was also the most recent time that Shaheen had to run for her seat as a senator. More recently, when New Hampshire's other senator ran for election in 2016, she actually had a deficit of nearly 40 percentage points in the voter turnout ratio, which at the end of the day was still not quite enough for her to lose that election, although she did win by just 0.2% of the vote. Overall, these are pretty good numbers for Republican senatorial candidates in the state and pretty bad numbers for their Democratic counterparts. But of course, these are relative to raw House turnout numbers, which, as we just saw earlier, slightly favor Democrats. Oh, they have been for the past few cycles anyway. And it's the reason why the state currently has 2 Democratic senators in spite of these numbers. Okay, let's toss that aside and lastly consider the approval rating of the incumbent. In this case, it is Senator Jeanne Shaheen. As of this video, her approval rating is plus 15 points in the state, which is actually pretty good considering the state just barely elected her to her position 6 years ago. I guess enough New Hampshire voters have come around to liking her. So now we have everything we need. We have projected raw House turnout numbers, we have voter turnout ratios, and we have an approval rating of the incumbent. Let's give all those to Pollbot here to calculate how we think this is going to go for the Senate race of New Hampshire in 2020. Pollbot. And there you have it, Shaheen winning by an 11.71% margin of victory this time around in 2020. That is much better, a big improvement on her 2014 performance when she won by about 3% margin of victory. I think Shaheen is very likely to benefit from having both a Republican and a Libertarian to run against this time. If either party is on the fence for their Republican or Libertarian candidate, they tend to cross over between those two parties. In other words, Libertarian voters tend to align more generally with Republicans than they do Democrats, so that will certainly be helping Shaheen this time around. We do have her projected to win for a third time, so let's make that official and put it on our senatorial map right now. Mark it. Up next, we are looking at a gubernatorial election in New Hampshire. Incumbent Republican Governor Sununu is running for a third term of 2 years. New Hampshire is one of 2 states in the country, along with its neighbor Vermont, that has gubernatorial elections every 2 years rather than every 4. Governor Sununu is running against a Democratic challenger named Dan Feltz. To see how New Hampshire voters have been electing governors, let's look at some more voter turnout ratios right now. And here we're looking at some numbers that even more explicitly than we saw for the Senate numbers favor Republicans over Democrats. I'm more interested in the numbers that have been we've been recording more recently. So 2018, the difference between Republicans and Democrats greatly favors Republicans by about 35 percentage points. Compare that to 2010 when Democrats actually had the advantage of almost 30 percentage points. And we see trajectories that are greatly favoring Republican gubernatorial candidates running in the state of New Hampshire. And this is backed up by the fact that Sununu, the current Republican governor, has been occupying his position since the beginning of 2017. And prior to that, going back to the beginning of the decade, it has been exclusively Democratic control. So these numbers do paint a very clear picture that the state is beginning to trend Republican when it comes to electing governors. And remember, because these are relative to raw House turnout numbers, these differences this stark do matter a lot. So let's toss those aside and lastly consider the approval rating of the incumbent, in this case, Governor Sununu. He actually has one of the best approval ratings as a governor in the country right now. It is plus 29 points, which is excellent, and continues the trend of, there being very, very popular Republican governors in New England states that otherwise tend to vote Democrat more often than not. The other great examples being Massachusetts and Vermont. So now we have everything we need. Let's give all of our variables to Pollbot to calculate who's going to win this time around in the governor's race of 2020. Pollbot. And there's your answer. Again, it is Sununu. He's winning by about a projected 10.86% margin of victory, which is an improvement from his 2018 election by about 3 percentage points. Clearly a very popular governor in the state with a very good approval rating, very likely to win again. Let's make that official and put it on our gubernatorial map right now. Mark it. And now it is time for the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. New Hampshire is the state that last voted for a Republican presidential candidate in 2000 when they broke for George W. Bush over Vice President Al Gore in an otherwise razor-thin election year. More recently, the state did break for Hillary Clinton in 2016 over President Trump, but it was one of the closest outcomes in the country. She won by about 0.4%. For this reason, Republicans and Donald Trump's re-election team have New Hampshire in their crosshairs this time around, as well they should. To get more insight about how New Hampshire citizens have been voting for their presidents, let's pull up some more voter turnout ratios right now. Okay, and here we do see some pretty revealing numbers, not in the same way that our other ratios were in the previous sections of this video. There is no clear winner in these numbers. Actually, they're super competitive. They favored Barack Obama in 2012 over Republican Mitt Romney slightly by under 3 percentage points. And then the tables turned 4 years later in 2016 when Hillary Clinton carried the state, but Trump won the presidency. And we do see a very clear deficit on Hillary Clinton's end by just under 6 percentage points. A more stark contrast that year than we saw 4 years prior when we were having Obama and Romney. Now again, these are relative to raw House turnout numbers, so her lower percentage value here was still not enough for her to lose the state, although it was more competitive in 2016 certainly than it was in 2012. What these numbers tell me is that New Hampshire voters were much more enthusiastic to vote for Barack Obama than they were for Hillary Clinton. I don't necessarily think there was a a lagging enthusiasm for Mitt Romney 8 years ago because he is another Republican governor from New England before he became a senator for Utah. So I don't imagine he was weak in the state. It was just that Obama was stronger. Hillary Clinton was just a poor candidate 4 years ago, as evidenced by these numbers coming out of New Hampshire. Okay, let's toss those numbers aside. Lastly, we do have to consider the approval rating of the incumbent. In this case, it is President Trump. As of this video, he is sitting at negative 22 points in the state of New Hampshire. Specifically, he has the approval of 37% of people and the disapproval of 59%. So any advantage that he may have had in those turnout ratios that we just saw is kind of negated by this pretty poor performance in terms of approval rating. That's the biggest obstacle he has to overcome in the state, honestly, is he has to convince more people to like him. The ratios are there, but his personal approval rating is not. Regardless, we do have everything we need now to calculate how this is going to happen in November. So let's give everything to Pollbot to calculate the result, Biden or Trump in New Hampshire. Pollbot. Wow, okay, and there you have it. Biden is projected to carry the state of New Hampshire by about a 10.07% margin of victory. This is pretty extraordinary, actually. It's nearly the margin of victory that Obama enjoyed in 2008, which was his better performance. This outcome is obviously the result of Trump's really poor approval rating in the state. Everything else is working kind of for him. I mean, competitive at the state level for House districts. He had the advantage in turnout ratios 4 years ago, but voters in the state just don't like him enough to be able to justify voting for him this time around either. So let's make that official and put it on our presidential map right now. Mark it. So all the election results are now in for the state of New Hampshire, and we've seen incumbents across parties holding on to their seats more definitively than they have in the past. We see Joe Biden carrying the state by a much larger margin than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. Let's talk briefly about the future of the state by pulling up an old line graph and 3 new ones. First, let's take a bit of a closer look at the raw House turnout numbers going back over the past decade for the state of New Hampshire. Let's look specifically at the slope values for both of those equations there. So basically what those are telling us, so for Democrats it's 21.6, and for Republicans it's 4.2. What those values are telling us is the average increase in voter turnout every 2 years going back over the past decade for House candidates running in the state. So every 2 years on average, Democrats have been adding on 21,600 votes, and Republicans have been adding on 4,200 votes. At first glance, you may think, okay, those numbers aren't that big, but remember, New Hampshire is not a very populated state, and you kind of really have to look at how those numbers compare to each other. And 21.6 is several times higher than 4.2, so that pretty heavily favors Democrats at the House level anyway. And the reason for that big difference is largely because of that that better than expected turnout in 2018 on Democrats' end, where they fell off from 2016 numbers just slightly, a lot less than Republicans did going from 2016 to 2018. At the House level, this is pretty good news for the 2 House districts in New Hampshire from a Democrat's perspective anyway. Where the state does get more interesting for me is in these other 3 line graphs. These are estimates for the rate of increase or decrease in those voter turnout ratios that I was using earlier in my calculations, and all 3 of them very obviously favor Republicans in the state. Now, we have projected that Democrat Jeanne Shaheen is going to win her Senate seat again, and that is only because projected House turnout numbers are pretty favorable for Democrats at this point in New Hampshire. Looking beyond 2020, I do expect Senate seats in New Hampshire to become much more competitive, winnable seats for Republicans, as long as there's not also a libertarian running on the ticket. The best improvement for Republicans in the state is clearly at the governor level. Sununu is one of the most popular governors in the country right now, and I think that is very evident in the trajectory of these turnout ratios that we've observed over the last decade, where there's an obvious upward trajectory for Republicans and a negative trajectory for Democrats. State becomes less clear at the presidential level. I mean, remember those values were really close to each other. They did improve slightly going from 2012 to 2016 for Republicans, and that is chiefly because I think Hillary Clinton was not the right fit for New Hampshire, as her ratio decreased from Barack Obama's in contrast to Trump's versus Romney's. Looking at these 3 graphs together, though, it does appear that Republicans are improving their prospects despite the fact that Democrats seem to be doing better in raw House turnout numbers. So the state's very interesting. You know, it's very hard to predict. But, well, let's toss all of those graphs aside, and I will give you my best attempt at my final consensus on New Hampshire. It is going to remain, relatively centrist for at least a couple more presidential election cycles anyway, I think. But beyond that, maybe beyond 2024, I would expect the state to become more Republican as time goes by. Sununu appears to be a very popular Republican governor in the state, and he's not term limited. He can continue to run again and again every 2 years as long as he wants, and as long as he keeps, approval ratings as high as they are. I do think it'll take time to get past Donald Trump's brand of, approach to being a Republican until we really start to see the state drift to the right, because they clearly don't like Trump, but they clearly do like their governor. I'm going to say in about, 6 to 8 years, we're going to see a very clearly more Republican New Hampshire. That doesn't necessarily mean it'll be safe for Republicans. I think it'll still be relatively close to the center, but it will slightly favor the Republican Party much more so a few years from now than it does today. That just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date, so if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching, thank you for voting, and I'll see you next time.